Here's everything you need to know about the second house in natal astrology. And make sure that you stick around until the end of this video, where I'll be sharing with you more tools and resources for how you can master the houses within your natal chart. The second house is the house of our wealth and our movable possessions. The second house is traditionally called anaphora, which means exit from the gates of Hades, which was the name given to the second house by the ancient Greeks because the opposite house to the second house, the eighth house, is called apokataphora, which means descent into the gates of Hades. The second house is a succedent house, which usually means that planets within this house have 50% power to show their stuff in comparison to planets in angular houses. The second house is the house that we go to in order to find out everything we need to know about our natal promise as far as wealth and money and finances are concerned within this lifetime. And from a traditional astrology perspective, that's all we find in the second house. We don't find our values, we don't find our pleasures. All we find in the second house is cold, hard cash, or the lack thereof. Houses are usually considered to be good or strong based on the aspects that those houses have to the ascendant. And technically speaking, since the second house is directly adjacent to the ascendant, the second house from a traditional astrological perspective doesn't really have an aspect to the ascendant. However, since the second house is a succedent house from the ascendant, which means it's following the ascendant, the ancients thought that the second house naturally had a great amount of power and benevolence associated with it purely through association. So, if you're close to the king, some of the king's royalty rubs off on you as well, and that's exactly what happens with the second house in relationship to the ascendant. If we were to apply the Chaldean order to the 12 houses, then Jupiter is the planet that is associated with the second house. Which makes sense because Jupiter is a god of benevolence, of bounty, of abundance, and of fortune, and the second house naturally has these same associations as well. The ancients also thought that the second house was a very good house because of the natural way that the sky and all of the planets with it move based on diurnal or primary motion. This means that if any planets were in the second house, those planets naturally had within themselves the promise of ultimately rising to the ascendant, which was thought of as being a most auspicious thing indeed. Therefore, what we find in second house planets is a promise of support, of sustenance, and of having all the things we need in order to take care of ourselves in this lifetime. And any lack or karma that we might find ourselves facing in this lifetime in relationship to the topic of money and personal finances can usually be attributed to something happening either to our second house or to the ruler of our second house, wherever that ruler is placed within our natal charts. Another thing interesting about the second house is that with Jupiter being associated with the second house on the Chaldean order, we find that the second house also has to do with food. Because if the first house represents our physical body that we inherit upon incarnating into this lifetime, then the second house represents the very next thing that we find ourselves faced with after incarnating into this physical world, which is food. Since babies spend a substantial amount of their coherent waking hours eating, the relationship between the first house and the second house, which is fundamentally the relationship between the body and food, is one that is absolutely inseparable. Speaking of food, the second house also has to do with the throat and everything we put in it. As far as food is concerned, planets in your second house have a direct impact on your relationship to money in general. And an interesting traditional astrology pro tip is that if you have the ruler of the ascendant in the second house or the ruler of the second house in the ascendant, that was traditionally considered to be a sign of entrepreneurship. To receive a free sample chapter of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, set to be published in spring 2023, sign up for my newsletter down below where you'll also gain access to other giveaways as well as free lectures from my private masterclass series. If you've loved this video on the second house, then follow this link to learn everything you need to know about the third house.